I think since healthcare passed, everything that would have made a lot of us oppose it because we didn't think it was pulled down cost, that case has been strengthened. It's been strengthened by the Medicare actuary who came out again with a study saying after it passed it will increase costs. A RAND Corporation study saying healthcare inflation will rise 1% a year faster than it would have without the bill. I've heard actually more doctors say I can't operate under this bill since it passed than I did before, as people begin to factor in how they're going to try to operate. And so to me, that belief that a bunch of smart people can organize 17% of the American economy, soon to be 20, soon to be 25, is a myth, and that within a few years, the impracticalities of it, even if they get most of the stuff right, if they get 20% wrong, it will create a holy mess. And so I think we'll be dealing with this issue quite a lot for that reason. Sir?
Several comments. First of all, just talking about the Congress itself. I'll be leaving after this year, 17 years, and I confess to a considerable amount of disappointment in the level of discourse in Congress. The notable lack of thoughtfulness, great belief in ideology. And I never thought I would see in America where thoughtfulness had my own ideology. Certainly that was not true in the early years of our nation. That's the example here. And we got Black Thornberries in the world really have a great deal of discoveries. A lot of it's just push the red button because I'm a Republican and push the green one because I'm a Democrat. And I really miss, as I have pointed out, the counterpoint really has some deep insight into the issue we're dealing with. Do you think this is a bit of a trend? Or has this always been there? I just had a glorified vision in Congress before I got here.
Yeah. Well, I think just the week before you got there, it was like Socrates, it was like the symposium. Now, first, you mentioned Pat Moynihan. He has one of my favorite quotations, which summarizes what I was saying at the beginning, which is the central conservative truth is that culture matters most, and the central liberal truth is that government can sometimes change culture. And I just love that quotation, so I always say it when I can. I've watched politics from the outside, and from the House and the Senate from the outside, what's so striking is the power of teams. And that politics is a team sport. You don't get anything done alone. But if you become simply a member of a team, you end up dehumanizing people on the other team. And I'm going to give you a very extreme example, but I think it emphasizes how teamism can shape thinking. There's a woman who, I've forgotten her name now, a French journalist, who interviewed people who committed the Rwandan genocide. And again, this is an extreme example. And so she runs into a guy who had decapitated his neighbor of 25 years because he was Tutsi. And she said, you lived next to this guy for 25 years, you were a friend, what were you thinking when you chopped off his head with a machete? And he said, at that moment, I wasn't really seeing him as my neighbor. His features got all fuzzy for me, and I saw him as a Tutsi. And so it was sort of dehumanizing. And that's obviously, again, an extreme example. But in my view, when you get in teams and other teams, and I don't know how much contact in the House there is, but in the Senate, I remember I talked to Evan Bayh the day he announced his retirement, and he said, we've met as a body since I got here 12 years, twice. We met here as a body after 9/11 and after during Clinton impeachment. There was never a moment when we all talked. And I do think there's been that slow dehumanization. And now, part of it is cyclical. Alexander Hamilton, who I talked about, was murdered by the vice president. So that's reasonably polarizing. But it goes in cycles. And I thought we were coming out of a cycle when Crossfire was canceled and that sort of media world changed. It turned out people didn't like Crossfire because they'd spend half their time listening to the other side, and now they just get to hear their own side. So I see no change, no breaking to it. But I guess, you know, there are a few things that I think could contribute. Well, Tim Wirth, who I ran into last week in Colorado, said, you know, when he was in the Senate, when he started, the schedule was such that they had 3 weeks in town and 1 week home. And so since they were not rushing home every Thursday night, they spent more time here, got to know people a little better. That would be part of it. Redistricting is a small part. But to me, it's a matter of leadership and character. When you have leaders who are secure enough to encourage the kind of discussion you mentioned, you will have a Congress that does it. Because in my view...
Well, it's a very pragmatic approach, really. They want their prejudices reinforced. And I find that I'm a scientist. They come to me, they ask me about a scientific question. If I give them the answer, which is scientifically correct, and which I wish to do, if it agrees with their prejudices, I am one of the greatest scientists in the world. If it disagrees with their prejudices, they sort of shake their head and walk away. I really don't know what I'm talking about. Everyone seems to want their prejudices to dominate without recognizing their prejudices.
Yeah, and there's no substitute to character for that. I mean, you just have to have a higher loyalty than to short-term political interest. And that's, you know, obviously it strengthens the power of leadership to enforce party discipline. And I will say, watching from the outside, my perception is, when I first started covering the House, there were more policy entrepreneurs in the backbenches than there were today. That you would hang around people, I remember there was a guy named Jim Porter from New Jersey, Jack Kemp from New York, and they had weird ideas, good ideas, weird ideas, some on defense policy, some on economics. Frankly, when I started covering it, Newt Gingrich was a junior backbencher. He had a bunch of weird ideas. And then once he became leader, he sort of squelched the possibility of other people like him rising. So to me, it's that failure of leadership in the culture set by the leaders.
Who among your colleagues do you keep a file on as far as, you know, like Mr. Thornberry's commentators?
I'm going to exclude all my New York Times colleagues, because if I mention some and not others, I'll lose friends. Obviously, I live in the shadow of Tom Friedman. I went to the Middle East with Tom Friedman. Somebody said going to the Middle East with Tom Friedman is like going to the mall with Britney Spears. The other Tom story I tell is...
Who is Britney Spears?
Remember Dinah Shore? She's sort of like Dinah But so, you know, let's start with some of the others. There are people who I think are not party line columnists who objectively give you that view. I look at a guy named Robert Samuelson, who writes for the Post. I think he's just tremendously honest. There's a guy, Fareed Zakaria. Robert Kagan writes for the Post periodically. There's a guy, Stuart Taylor, who used to write the National Journal on legal matters. These are guys you don't know where they're coming from, but you can sort of outsource your brain to them because you trust they're going to look at it honestly. There's a Democratic guy at the Brookings Institution named Bill Alston, who I always read and think highly of. So there are people like that. I mean, Charles Krauthammer's a friend. He's the only columnist I know who can write a column just by thinking. The rest of us need to gather other people's thinking. He can just do it. And so there are people of that nature who are just, who have the mentality that my job is not to champion liberalism or conservatism. It's just to write, just to be honest with the facts.